Hello and welcome back to the Little Craft House. If we haven't met before, my name is Nicole. Instead of a tutorial today, I thought that we would do a compilation of some of my most favourite reels, which show you a whole bunch of different designs that you can do with polymer clay to make some really cool and fun earrings. Most of these reels are quite fast, but I do have a lot of the ideas as full-length step-by-step tutorials in the full-length video section here on YouTube. I'll try and link the majority of these full-length tutorials in the description box, so if you're wanting a more slower step-by-step version, you can check those ones out. The first set of ideas that I'm going to be showing you today are with polymer clay and foil. The foil that I like to use is very similar to a gold leaf foil. It comes in small little squared sheets and it comes in a variety of colours, not just gold, which means that there is so many possibilities for us to work with it. So you have to be very careful when working with the gold leaf foil as it is quite fragile and can rip easy, but the results are absolutely gorgeous. So one of my most favourite things to do with this foil is to lump our clay into quite large pieces to start with, apply the foil, then as we roll it out it will leave a beautiful little crackle effect. With this effect, the amount of crackle that you get on your clay will depend on how much you roll your clay out. So the thicker the clay is to start with, the more that your clay will stretch as you roll it down, the more the foil will stretch and the larger the gaps of crackle will be. If you start with your clay quite thin, you won't be rolling much, therefore the crackle effect won't be quite as much as it is with the thicker clay. This is one of those techniques that you just need to play around with a little bit to start with and work out how much of a crackle you like. One advantage with using this foil on the polymer clay is that you don't need any adhesive to help the foil to stick. The clay is tacky enough and the foil is thin enough that it will stay on without needing any sort of adhesives. I do always recommend that you seal your pieces afterwards though. It will just help to protect that foil from rubbing or scratching off during wear if they're being used as earrings. In this example here, my clay is already rolled quite thin, so once I add the foil and roll, it only has the minimal crackle effect. I also used my cutter to include some of the black as well as some of the gold, and then I was able to resin the gold afterwards to give it a super shine but leave the black as a matte black finish. This gave it a really nice opposing effect and these earrings were quite popular. As well as doing the crackle effect, another thing that you can do with the foil is add in an imprint with either a texture sheet or in this case I'm using sandpaper. By using the sandpaper, it's a great easy way to add extra texture to your pieces. The final technique that I want to show you is doing a foil removal technique. This gives our pieces a bit of a gold embossed look. So what I've done here is I'm just starting out with my flat clay and I'm just adding some little details and rolling it flat. I'm then going to get my foil and I am just trimming it down because I want to waste the least amount as possible of this. This is actually a really good technique to do if you've got scrappy little bits. Now I've got a rubber stamp here which I'm going to push into the clay over the top of the foil where I would like those embossed shapes to be. And then the trick is to use sticky tape, and this will remove any extra foil that is on the piece that has not been pushed down by that stamp. In the end, we end up with these nice embossed looking leaves. So this is one of my most favourite techniques to do with the foil. The next few techniques that I'm going to show you is how we can use stacked clay to create some really cool, unique effects. So to start off stacking this one, I've got my black clay, then my white clay, then my coloured clay all stacked on top of each other here. Each one of these clays has been rolled as thin as I could through the pasta machine, then taken down a little bit further with my rolling pin. Once I've got it all layered, I pop it through that pasta machine again on the thinnest setting so that it's all nicely smooshed together, and then I am just ripping at that sheet of clay and adding it onto my white base. So this is going to stack and layer these colours just all randomly all over this base clay, and because the colours are layered, we're going to get some of the white and the black come through. One final pass through the pasta machine, it will be nice and flat, yet have that nice look of depth within the colours. Next up, we have stacking to create a stripe. So there is quite a few different ways that we can create stripes using polymer clay. This is one of the techniques, which is by cutting out a whole bunch of rectangles that are the same size and then just stacking each of those rectangles onto each other. We can then make slices and we will have a whole bunch of little sliced stripes, which we can either tile next to each other to make one big long stripy pattern, or as I've done here, I'm alternating which direction they go in to create a bit of a basket weave effect. This pattern's quite fun and effective and looks really good on larger pieces such as trinket dishes as well. The next stacking technique is a great one if you've got lots of coordinating scrap pieces of clay. I've rolled each one here into a sausage. It doesn't matter that they are different thicknesses and sizes. That kind of adds to the effect. And then I am just chopping off that little ratty end, squishing it all down to make a rectangular shape and then slicing. I find it much easier to tile if I squish into a rectangular or a triangular shape than just rolling it into a circle. So I'm just tiling it down onto another piece of my scrap clay that I have rolled out nice and thin. Gonna add a bit of pressure with the roller here to squish it together and then cut out my pieces. Once baked, I used my Posca paint pen to just add some dots and dashes and just some little features onto each of my pieces. The next design is another one for when you have little pieces of coordinating clay left over from other projects. I've rolled each of the colours to the thinnest setting on my pasta machine, and then I'm just ripping at each of these pieces and popping them down on my base clay to create that little bit of a clay pizza effect. This technique is super easy, super effective, and you don't have to be perfect. Each of those pieces can be different sizes, different shapes. There is absolutely no need for perfection here because the more you add on, the better it looks. So this is absolutely perfect technique if you are just starting out. I'm also just adding some Posca effects here too whilst the clay is raw before baking. Usually when we have super soft, sticky clay, we don't like to work with it, but the last of our stacking techniques here is a really great one if you do have some of that super soft clay. With this one here, I used a couple of the Sculpey 3 brands as well as one of the Primos. The Primo I just had to get really over conditioned and nice and warm first so that it made it easier to squish. So what I did was roll each of these clays into a little bowl and put them onto my base clay. I then took my metal ball tip tool and just squished the ends of each of those balls down onto that base clay, and the result is a unique raised paint stroke effect. Next up, I'm going to share with you a few designs that I have done with my alcohol ink. The alcohol ink designs that I've created have been some of my most favouriteest designs. I really like that the alcohol ink is quite unpredictable and you're never quite sure exactly how it's going to turn out. It's also never repeatable either because it kind of does what it wants to do, it blends the way it wants to blend, and you're never able to repeat exactly the same patterns again. So as I mentioned in the beginning of today's video, I do have full step-by-step tutorials about each of these techniques in my full-length tutorial section on YouTube. With the alcohol inks, I always get asked lots of questions. So if you do have questions with alcohol ink, please go and check out those full-length tutorials. One thing I will say that I do like to do when using the alcohol ink though, is put down a layer of the blending solution or a weaker version of isopropyl alcohol first before I add my alcohol inks. This helps for those inks to do that blooming effect and really helps them to move around on top of the clay. You do have to be really careful when adding the ink onto your clay that you don't add too much because you don't want to have your clay dry out and be cracked. It can take a little bit of practice, but once you've mastered the technique, the effects are absolutely amazing. One thing I also like to do with my alcohol ink designs is add a layer of resin on top afterwards. This really helps to bring out those colours, the sparkles, and just the uniqueness and depth that the alcohol ink creates. There's a few different brands of alcohol inks that are available. My most favourite ones to use are the Couture Creations and also the Panata brands. The next technique that I want to share with you is some colour blends. This is where I'll take 2 or more pieces of clay and use a bit of a roll and fold technique until our clays have sufficiently overlapped that they stay together. In this process, the colours will blend together, creating either an ombre effect, like they do here with the blue, or more of a rainbow effect if more highly pigmented colours are used, like they are here with this fluoro design. So the easiest and fastest way to achieve these effects is with using a pasta machine. However, if you don't have a pasta machine, you can definitely just do it with an acrylic roller. You just need to keep rolling and folding in the same direction. Something that I like to do with blends as well is once I have my colour mostly blended together, I'll then add a layer of a metallic clay, a glitter clay, a pearlized clay, something that's got effect in it, add that to the back of my blend and continuously keep blending it together. This will then come through and change the overall effect of our colours by either adding that sparkle or shimmer or shine to the piece. Once you've created your blends, you can use them either as is, or you can use them in different sorts of design patterns. So here I've taken a blend along with a piece of white clay and I'm alternating them to make a pretty little striped pattern. Now I could use the stripe pattern as is, but I decided to make it into a checkerboard instead, which just turned out amazing. I really love how this one turned out. Another great way to use these blends is to cut our blend up into strips, and then when laying down onto a base piece of clay, alternate the direction that the colours face, and this gives a great little alternating pattern. I'm then filling the gaps with some black clay. Doing this will hide any of my imperfect cuts and also just adds a great little feature to the piece as well. This is a great technique to use if you're making larger size pieces such as the trinket bowls or larger maxi earrings. A few ideas ago I showed you how I created a stripe with the blend. This time I'm just doing it with a pink and white, and then from the stripe I'm going to alternate it down to create a checkerboard pattern. After creating the checkerboard pattern, I'm going to take it one step further and I'm then going to cut diagonally and then move each of the pieces slightly to the side. This creates a really cool, unique, fun diamond zigzaggy effect. I'm going to dedicate these next ideas all to creating stripes. So I mentioned earlier in today's tutorial about the stacking technique for stripes. This here is my other favourite technique for creating them, and that's by using an extruder to create long strips all the same length and then tiling them onto a base clay. This design here was for Halloween, so I chose Halloween inspired colours. However, you can choose any colour combination you like. And I've found that doing this technique using the extruder is the most accurate, creating equal sized stripes. This next design, however, is the complete opposite, and each of the stripes is completely different in lengths and thicknesses, but that is the beauty of this effect. This design is also a great way to use up all those little scrappy pieces of clay we have lying around as well. Now for this one, I decided to use my ball tip tool to squish down the clay, giving it a bit of a textured effect. However, just using a rolling pin and rolling it flat would also work really well. The next stripy design effect that I'm going to show you is a bit of a combination of lots of different techniques that we've already used. So I like to use my little clay pizza design by putting all the colours of clay onto a base piece of clay. I've then cut and stacked the clay on top of itself. I do this a few times, layering it on top of itself, and then once cut, we end up with these really cool little dashed stripes. Now the next way is very similar to that. However, this is actually a piece of clay that I had done a different pattern on top of, cut my pieces out, and then this is the scraps. So with those scraps, they were on a base piece of clay, and I've also added in a piece of red clay as well, just to add a solid colour in. And I'm just going to stack each of my scraps on top of each other, and then adding in a little piece of that red clay every so often as well. Once they're all stacked together, I'm going to give it a nice squeeze together to make sure that there is no air gaps. And then once I slice it, we end up with this cool, funky striped pattern. This can then be tiled together to make its own design. And once again, this is truly unique, and even if we had similar scraps, we would never get the same design exactly the same again. The last design idea in our striped section is actually another version of a checkerboard. So I have my base clay, and then I have extruded a bunch of clay out using my extruder. I've put my base clay onto some lined paper, and this is going to give us a guide for making our stripes nice and consistent. I use a piece of non-stick baking paper on the top and give a gentle rub just to secure those pieces in position before giving it a little roll with my rolling pin. So I could either leave it there as the striped design, otherwise, as I did here, I took it off, flipped it around, and then used the lines again to guide my clay in the opposite direction. This will create my checkerboard effect. And of course, you don't have to limit yourself with just 2 colours for this pattern. You could use all different coloured strings, and that would create a really fun multicoloured effect too. Next up, I wanted to talk about designs that use stencils and silk screens along with different additives to make patterns on the clay. There is quite a big difference between stencils and silk screens, even though they are a very similar item. In this design here, I'm using a stencil. That is where the design has been cut out of and removed from a plastic film. But this is quite a thin design, so it is not raised up too much, but enough to allow me to fill in the gaps using the mica powder. With a stencil with the larger gaps, it gives you more options of elements that you can use to fill that design. So glitter and embossing powders, which are a bit chunkier, are able to be used with this, unlike they can with a silk screen. With stencils, I always like to apply the powders with my finger because I find that I can push the powder in, which gives it a firmer hold onto the design. Next up, we have a silk screen. So even though it looks quite similar, the silk screen is actually made out of a fabric and mesh combination. So where you can see the design, that is actually a very fine mesh. So paint always works best on silk screens. You can use mica powders as long as they are quite a fine powder, but it needs to be able to go through the mesh without clogging it. When using additives such as mica powders and paints, it's always recommended to seal for longevity of those elements. Even though I tend to just stick with the paint for the silk screens, there are still some different things that we can do to make them different and stand out. So here I just silk screened on some gold onto my white clay. I chose a nice leafy design that has quite an open pattern within it. Once that's done, I bake them up, and then I get my Posca paint pens and I use these to colour in those leaf shapes. This is a really great technique when your silkscreen design isn't too small, when there's some nice large areas for you to colour. Once I've finished adding all the Posca, I will pop them back into the oven to bake for another 15 minutes just to set those pens, and then I will give them a coat of resin to secure the paint onto the pieces. Next up, I have another way to use a stencil. So this time I'm putting the stencil onto my clay and giving it a little roll to bring the clay up to the top of the stencil. I'm then using my sandpaper on top to give that raised clay some texture. This is a really simple way to make a design stand out with only using that one single colour. Another way that we can use the pigment powder on our clay is to brush it on using either your finger or a little brush, and then we're going to get our ball tool and just start tapping away. This makes a really fun and easy faux metal effect, which I'll quite often use for my coordinating pieces. Next up, I have another one of my favourite little designs. This one here, I'm using a silicone mould to create some flowers. This silicone mould here is one of my most favouriteest moulds, and it's actually one that I made myself. I made it using some pieces from a broken pair of earrings and some liquid silicone. If you're interested in making your own moulds, I do have some full tutorials on doing that, as well as using moulds in our designs. By using the mould, our little flowers are quite three-dimensional and raised up from the base of our slab. So when we create our earrings, I need to make sure that they aren't too big and chunky so that they're not too heavy. An alternate to using moulds is just by using cutters. So this design here just uses some simple flower cutters that I had on hand, and I've just cut out a whole bunch of little white flowers. I'm just going to place them randomly onto my base clay, and I think that that black really makes it pop. I'm then going to give a little roll over the top to flatten them down so that they are the same level as my base clay, before adding some little yellow circles to the centres for the centre of the flower. If I wanted to, I could leave these as is so that they would add that little three-dimensional character to the flowers. However, I did just roll them down flat before using my sandpaper to create that nice textured effect on the clay. This is such a cute little pattern, especially for spring pairs of earrings. So finally, to finish today's little compilation, I'm just ending with my most favouriteest painted design that I have ever done, and I need to recreate this into a bit of a wall art, I think, because I absolutely loved it. I just want to say a big thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you've enjoyed today's little compilation of ideas, and I hope that it's got you inspired with some new design ideas for creating earrings for yourself. If you do take some inspo, I would absolutely love to see the designs that you come up with, so please tag me on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or here on YouTube. I'd also love and appreciate if you guys could hit the follow button on each of those socials, as well as here on YouTube, so you don't miss out on any future tutorials or inspo that I pop up. So thank you once again for joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed today. I'll see you again next week with some more ideas. See you then. Bye.